20 minutes, it's enough. It's a very big subject, and I'm going to speak about it very quickly in outline form. But autonomy has a particular meaning in politics. Autonomy is your independence despite dependence. That's one way of phrasing it. Autonomy is that you go to a place to work and he's your boss and you can't get rid of him. I mean, you make every effort, but it doesn't work easily. But at the same time, you form a trade union so that you can be autonomous of him in your struggle against him, in spite of the fact that he has your bread in his pocket. So it's really an important Marxist way of looking at working class people and how we are attached to capital, but at the same time looking always to see how we can be independent of capital so we can make a struggle against capital. And that's perfectly clear, and if you think back, you know how many ways in which that applies to you and applies to the struggles that you know about, that you are independent and very important, but autonomous. Now, when that word was talked about and when that concept was explained in the 19th century and sometimes in the 20th, we had an idea that working class meant homogeneous. We were all, most of us in the world, were working class. We were working, and we were a class, and we were an exploited class. And there were some people who understood the differences among us and the struggles that we're taking on. And I want to point to one, and that was a woman called Eleanor Rathbone, who understood that we were, as one woman put it, the slave of slaves, we women. We worked and were the slaves of men who were themselves slaves. And she fought for a lot of years. That's an interesting story which we haven't time to tell tonight, but we have a book about her, and we have various things to explain her, because she was so important to us, because she fought and finally got a family allowance for us, which we now call child benefit. And the money that we got from the post office once a week, we didn't get it at the beginning for the first child, but for the second and other children, we got the family. That was our autonomy. That was what gave us a power, not only against capital in general, but against the men who may have beaten us, or they didn't beat us, but they drank instead of bringing the money home. In all kinds of ways, we were dependent on them, and in this one way, which took her till 1945, and she had people to help her. She really formed a kind of movement in order to get it. That was our autonomy as women in the UK. I'm not talking about the colonies, they didn't get it, okay? And part of the reason that many of them came, those of us from the colonies came here, was precisely because they could get some family allowance when they reached. And that's a very good reason to make the trip across the Atlantic and leave a lot of things behind. Okay, but the conception of the unity of the class, of the homogeneity of the class, was really very fixed in many people's minds, including in the minds of the left organizations, so that when the black movement in many countries, including in this, they said, we want black sections. They said, what, you want to destroy the unity of the working class. They didn't say the unity didn't exist and we have to build it. They said it was there and we couldn't see it because it was so invisible. In fact, because it was a part-time thing, at times we absolutely became homogeneous. We've all voted for some one thing, but day to day we were dealing with racism, and we were dealing with sexism, and we were dealing with a great many other divisions among us, which only became visible fundamentally in the 60s. Now, most of you probably weren't born in the 60s, but you know there was a movement of black people. You know, for example, you know about Malcolm X, and you know about Martin Luther King, and you know there was something going on there of people of color which was supported often by some white people, but it was a movement which had as its foundation the autonomy of people of color, of black people in particular. And then you saw a women's movement, and many of you have seen it. Unfortunately, doesn't always look very good. Sometimes they get to be prime minister and then what do you do? We'll discuss what you do, you know, because it's not something you can just leave aside. But women took our autonomy. And the people in the, now I go to this country, the people in this country who were most autonomous of men and in general were single mothers on benefits. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, until Thatcher began to destroy it, and then that Labour lawyer, what is that? Blair, right? He continued what Thatcher had begun and really took a lot of the money from single mothers, but single mothers helped enormously in forming the women's movement, and in fact in forming every other movement that began to pop up, because there was the gay men, and then there were the lesbian women, and there were the people with disabilities, first the women and then the men. There were people from every single sector. I'm trying to think, give me the names of our organization.
Invisible.
Women with visible and invisible disabilities.
English collective.
The English, that was really one of the earliest things, because we had by this time formed a Wages for Housework campaign. Now that was a peculiar thing because it meant that all women could relate to it, because all women were doing the caring work for the family, whatever country they were in, whatever technology they had at their disposal, whatever exploitation they were suffering, they were also suffering the fact that they were expected to take care of people, but nobody was expected to take care of them. And they were not supposed to get any money for this work. They were supposed to do it out of love. I don't know how you live on love, but they proposed it for half the human race. And so what we wanted to do was to build a movement, and it became a movement of many different sectors, because once we formed it, a lesbian group said, we want to be part of your organization. We think that lesbians have better sexual choices if they have money and they're mothers, and almost all women were mothers at that time. Most were, and most still are. And so they came into the Wages for Housework campaign. There was a movement outside, and there was a movement that was expressing itself inside the international network of the Wages for Housework campaign. And of course, as soon as they came, and they said, we're for money for women precisely for us to have sexual and other choices and the ability to live with women rather than with men, which was our choice. And immediately that happened, we were delighted to welcome them. We said yes, but we had to work out how they were going to deal with other sectors. Of course, we said, no, you cannot have one line for lesbian women, one political line for lesbian women, and one political line for straight women. We are for your being accountable to all the other women. You make your position clear, why you want wages for housework, how you want to struggle for it. There was Section 28, wasn't it, at a certain point where you had to, where Thatcher was really threatening to throw all lesbians out of their jobs because they were ruining children's minds or something. You know how she acted. And we had to make a battle in order to throw Section 28, and we did. And lesbian women from the Wages for Housework campaign led the campaign in its participation. But at the same time, another group of women had said that we have a particular interest, and that was sex workers. And they were women from the campaign who kind of came out as sex workers and said, well, we want our own organization too. When they formed the English Collective of Prostitutes, which was in response to a massive strike of sex workers in France. They took over the churches, 1975 it was, I think. Yeah. And when our women decided to form an organization, they were the French Collective of Prostitutes, so we were the English Collective of Prostitutes. And for my sins, they suggested that I would speak for them because I was a respectable married woman, and I was therefore not vulnerable in the ways that lesbian women were vulnerable to have their children taken from them, to lose their jobs, to lose their housing, to be vulnerable in all kinds of ways if your sexual choice is not mainstream at that time. And so I spoke for the ECP, and I learned a lot, and I also made connection with the women in the US who were also, as the campaign was growing there, who also had a lesbian organization. It had come from Canada to begin with, and also an organization of sex workers, which was our international network. But always the women who were either lesbian or a sex worker, or both, as it turned out, they were interested in the issues that they had to face. And we wanted them to be, the whole organization, to be on the basis of what they were saying. That would be the line of the rest of us. Everybody would be anti-discrimination against lesbian women and against sex workers, and their children had to be protected so they weren't taken into care because they were doing something which was not what the state proposed. And we worked out how, on the one hand, the women of particular organization, these two, and I have to add, at about that same time, Black Women for Wages for Housework was formed, which Crystal mentioned when she spoke. And there were these three organizations that were independent of each other. They were autonomous of each other, but they were absolutely part of a collective which was accountable to each other at the same time. and it worked. The thing was, it worked. We soon got into the habit of not being racist. You can, you know. And not being anti-lesbian, or, you know, you're a little off when you speak to these. And not anti-sex worker. We all had the position of sex workers, lesbian women, black women, and in fact, black then meant women of color. It didn't mean only of Afro descent, it meant anybody. Turkish women considered themselves black. That was very crucial to the 70s, that there was really a connection between people of color, which was expressed in the color. It was expressed as black. So that's what we meant by autonomy. We did not expect, if we were together as different sectors, that we would lose all the training that we had in our lives up to that point, all the prejudices, all the feeling different from, you know, all the manufactured crises that are assumed in the society that we live in generally. We did not assume that. We assumed exactly the opposite. That if a sector were autonomous within a whole, which accepted the political perspective of the movement in general, which wanted to build a working class movement which could deal with the crises that we face everywhere in the world, and you know what those are, but you know what they are in this country at this moment. It's dire poverty is a crisis, that they could do it while keeping their eyes on their particular prize, while keeping their focus on the sector that which they were persecuted for being. Now, after that, Claire came in, and she was a woman with disabilities, and she decided to form an organization within the Wages for Housework Campaign, because money is the issue if you have disabilities. Don't believe that money doesn't matter. Only people who want to steal your money say that. And Claire formed Invisible, women with visible and invisible disabilities. You know, if you see women struggling up a flight of steps on the underground, maybe they have a heart problem, maybe they have an age problem, but they definitely have a problem, and it's definitely a problem which they must address in order to survive, and can form an organization or be part of the organization that Claire is the point of reference for. What were the other organizations that formed?
Women against single mother self-defense.
Single mother self-defense. That was the deal with the cuts and benefits that we had to fight all the time. But there was some pardon?
Women
Pardon?
against rape.
We said women against rape, yeah.
Then there was the All African Women's Women.
Well, the All African Women's Group is a different thing.
A whole set of other organizations.
There were a set of,
formed at
and
the same time.
for the moment, I can't think of them, and they're going to kill me later.
Payday.
And then
Payday.
Payday. There were some men who say, we accept your political position. We think that the power relation between women and men is based on money, and based on the fact that most of the work that women do, caring for everyone, including us, that makes a power relation, and we have the power in that relation. Not power in the society generally, but power in that relation. And they were ready to work with us And they formed their organization called Payday, and they've done very well with it. If you want to find out more about them, there are one or two people here from Payday who can tell you more about it. By the way, the meeting ends at 5:30, but that doesn't mean we can't continue the discussion at another point. The fact is that we have built not only an organization that works, which is not racist, which is not sexist, which is not homophobic, which is not in competition with each other, which is not full of the ambition that if we get things together and get a crowd with us, we can run for office in the local government or somewhere else, get our foot on the ladder, because, you know, ambition is the enemy of the working class movement. There are not too many people who are in any political party who are not personally ambitious for themselves. I'm ready to defend that statement if anyone dares to challenge it. Anyway, this is how we have formed organizations that have enabled Peruvian domestic workers to be part of a network. That's a problem with language, and Nina has the Spanish and one or two other women do, but we work around that difficulty. We have an organization in Thailand, and a lot of sex workers from Thailand. They have a fantastic organization which is not in the campaign but works with us and does respect the work that we do, and we often collaborate with some of the things that English Collective of Prostitutes and Us Pros in the US is able to work with, and other organizations in other countries. And we are able to build this network and to do important work like mobilizing against deportation, against Rwanda, against the racism of this poor young 24-year-old man who was shot by the police, and then they didn't want, you notice they didn't want to suspend the officer, and I heard today that the officers who have guns wanted to put down their guns because they didn't think he should be suspended for having killed a person. You know, we had people at the demonstration today who were showing that we are ready to do more against that kind of brutality and murder from the highest quarters. And me, you know, if I'd been in charge, which they would never allow, and the officers said that they would put their guns down, I would have said, perfect. Just do it before you go through the door and don't come back. A man like that, you know, they have to play around with it. And we're in a really desperate situation, and we really need the unity that I think autonomy can promote. Now, I want to just say one other thing. Every single movement has the element of movement, social movement that are formed by people, anti-deportation, anti-racist, anti-sexist, people with learning disabilities and people who are so-called mentally ill have formed the most fantastic organizations against the treatment they have received. We are soon going to have a multi-everything organization to defend the NHS because they want to privatize what remains after they have been privatizing for 20 or so years. And we feel that at this moment in time, that autonomy is practical, but, and But the struggle goes on within the autonomous movements. We are dealing with the ambitious within the movement. We are dealing with people who who want to use the movement for themselves. I have a dear friend who spoke about somebody who was in the movement, and she said he turned the movement into a hustle. And I thought, you know, Althea Jones LeQuant can put the word right. He turned the movement into a hustle. We're fighting that all the time. In other words, the fights that we have within the movement, the principal fights, not the fight that, you know, you have a little, you know, degree or something or other. Those fights are the class struggle in our movement to have autonomy. We are fighting for autonomy and against the control of the powers that be, even of the movement that we struggled always to form. I want to just say one thing finally. We have a very big problem right now among us. We had a movement that John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were the points of reference for, and brought thousands of people together, gave in to Zionism when they should never have, that racist, militarist, apartheid society, and it fell apart, but we didn't fall apart. We formed all kinds of movements, all kinds of organizations which are thriving and building and teaching us how to do what we want to accomplish. And that's what I think augurs well for the future, and autonomy, I think, can help. Thank you.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you for that clarity on what our movement is and what it can be and what we need to do. I'm going to now call, as I said earlier, for any questions, because this is a Q&A, which means you have to ask questions so Selma can answer them. Okay, we have a hand right there.
You know, it's very easy to tell people who are ambitious. You know, they're greedy, and you can see that in the way that they respond to things. And people, you know, if you're looking for it all the time and you find it from time to time, you become quite responsive, quite talented in picking it out. And if you are ambitious, we say, we want you to help, we want you to be part of our struggle, but you can't be part of the decision making. We don't let them near decisions. Sometimes they stay because they're really attracted to the organization, they stick around, but they don't make decisions for other people who are not going to benefit from what they propose we decide. And the point is, I don't think that this society is prepared to deal with ambition as a serious political problem. And one reason is because we have a Labour Party, where the very nature of the society and the organization within it is that you have to be ready to become a candidate, and there's a scrum for who is going to be the candidate. So ambition is built into the kind of organization that you're building if you're building the Labour Party. Now, I have to tell you one thing about the Labour Party. I know we're short of time. We had, from what I can gather, a wonderful candidate for leader of the Labour Party at one time who was not personally ambitious and who was absolutely dedicated to destroying capitalism. And that was an Iron Bevan from Wales. And he's the one who fought and gave us the health service. Another story will come another time. And when the Labour government, I think it was the Labour government, put a charge on prescriptions, a charge like 10p or something, he resigned from the cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think anybody would resign if we had to pay something? They're vying with each other to be in charge of selling the Labour bond, selling the NHS. But that was defeated by the trade unions. And we have to make sense of that event, it seems to me, when we're thinking about ambition and how many people have exercised their ambition through the trade unions rather than trying to represent us. This guy who's doing it, what's his name, Lynch, he can talk, man, and he's ready to act as well. He's a break from the trade unionists that most of us have known. But you can't put them in, if they're ambitious, move aside. There's no other way. It worked until one or two people were dissatisfied and grumbled about things and it wasn't right and all the rest. And there's only one solution to that. You call a meeting and everybody says what they think. That's how you deal with it. That's how we have dealt with every single crisis, and there have been many. It was really expensive. I remember we had a meeting that went well over time. It was at least an hour and a half on 10p. There was a question of whether we should have 10p more for the expenses when you travel somewhere, and other people said no, it's too much. And we just debated until we came to a conclusion. But it was important. And it was important because we have always said that any money that comes to the Wages for Housework campaign is not our money, but movement money. And when we make a decision, we make a decision on behalf of the movements that we represent. So the question of money has never been a sore point. There was this debate, but we didn't fight with each other. We argued with each other, and we decided, well, I can't remember whether it was for the 10p or not, but we came to a conclusion after a long discussion in which everybody made their views known. And they were wide-ranging, of course they were. But that's the one, you know, we had a vote. We had one meeting where we took a vote. We were having a conference, and it was a question of whether we should allow men to come. And that was a very heated debate. I can't remember what we decided. But we decided something, and we went with it, and it was fine. And it was not a principle that was general, but it was for that conference. Do you remember that?
Well,
They
the
were
men,
decided against, I think.
the
Oh,
men
that
are still
particular
with us, so
one.
it must have been the right decision.
No, they weren't coming to that conference, but that didn't mean that we were breaking the relationship with them, and it was early days in the relationship, I think. Since then, the men have been more or less welcome to everything we do. And not only welcome, but contributing, you know, it's very good for women and men to work together if the power relation is not dominating, because you have much more power, you have much more resources, you have much more imagination. You know, men are used to having money. That's very useful with women because we're not used to having it. And they have sometimes contributed to how we can spend it, which we more or less accept, at least we acknowledge and consider. We work very well together. We have chased men away who've been rude or things, you know, they come and we kick them out. But payday helps us to kick them out. On the general strike, when there's a movement for the general strike, we'll see about that. We're not in a position to call a general strike, but we are in a position to build a movement so that a general strike is possible, and so that we know what we want to know and work out how we want the movement to function so that if people want a general strike, it's known and acted on. You know, if people, you talk about, somebody mentioned consciousness. I don't know about consciousness. All I know is every once in a while, and it is once in a while, we all think the same and we're ready to do something about it. And it happens, and you know, Marx has a wonderful phrase. He says, revolution comes like a thief in the night. It means you don't know when it's coming. And it's not that they didn't know all the things the day after, that they didn't know the day before. It's not like that. It's a way of the collective touching power and looking at things differently, and you have no ways. He was a great genius. He didn't think he could find out. And you know, if he can't know, nobody can. You don't know how these things are going to happen, but you do know what you can be doing now to make it happen, to help it to happen, and to help it not be defeated when it does happen. And that's how you have to be dealing with politics. You know, there is no way that you can find out when the working class of any sector, of any country, of any area in the world is going to get itself together and say, enough, we've finished with this, I'm walking out. You know, you don't know, but you know how you can protect it in advance and make clear whose voice you want to be heard that's being shut up. And you want to make sure that the people at the bottom who are not necessarily, you know, from this country at all, I think that immigrant people who have come on these, what they call boats, and you know, you know, that they have a lot to say. And all kinds of people have a lot to say, and women have a lot to say. I don't mean women like the Prime Minister. I don't rate her very high. But I'm talking about grassroots people. You know, there's an article in The Guardian today. My son called me to tell me they're describing that women do housework. Well, somebody got consciousness. And you know, you don't know when something is going to catch the imagination of thousands and millions of people, and you have to have strong international connections or you're not doing your work. This is very serious, and if anybody wants to discuss this at greater length at another point, just let me know. But unless you are prepared to work out, you know, how you are in touch with others and how you are listening to others and how you are making sure that they are listening to you if you feel you have something to say, then you're not preparing for a general strike. You know, that's what I feel I can venture to say. I'm not moving around as once I did because I'm ancient and it takes a lot of energy which I may not have. But I'm dependent on the people in my organization to keep me informed, and I'm dependent to find out some things for myself. You all are moving in the movement. You're at a movement event today, and you want to take on where they're at, what they're thinking, how that fits in with what you're doing, and how you can maybe, even after this talk somewhat, make some movements in another direction. You have always to be changing and looking again, because every day people are changing, especially now. They're leaping ahead. You know, people who were never political are doing beach work, I hear. You know, Nikki told me about this woman who does beach work. What beach is she on?
Hastings.
Hastings Beach. She does beach work. Beach work is greeting the people that come in the boats and feeding them and bringing them up and fighting for them to stay. You know, all kinds of people are involved in that movement. They're moving ahead. It's not being acknowledged. And the problem is, if it's not being acknowledged in the movement, if we're not trying to make connections between this woman and other people elsewhere, if we are not protecting her, at least to make clear to her the dangers of organizations who want to exploit her. And I take one, what's her name, Stand Up to Racism is a Zionist front which we can prove, and there are people here who can help us to prove it. And they want to take over this movement. I hear they're very interested in putting their hands all over it, getting a reputation, which the ambitious will not find attractive. That's what the ambitious can do. They can, you know, be used and use people like her, or him, or whoever he is. You know, so I think that the question of what moment in time it is will be announcing itself, not on Radio 4 perhaps, but maybe some other radio. You know, you have to know what the hell is going on, and you have to know what your connections are, and how strong they are, and how clean they are, and how much other people can teach you. Next.
Women in high places, the woman prime
What?
minister. Women in high places, the women prime minister.
Women in high places.
Is it important?
Fascist in Italy.
What?
The fascist in Italy.
Yes, that's a woman now.
Yeah,
Yes, and she's probably,
going to win the election.
What?
She's probably going to win the election.
They think a Nazi in Italy is going to win the election, which is a defeat for us. It's a great defeat for us. But we have to deal with her by who she is. And the important thing about her is not that she's a woman, except to the degree that she tries to pass on shit to us because she has a right as a woman. You know, that's what, but she doesn't belong to us. We have nothing in common with her. She's the class enemy, and we treat her as that. And there's no, I don't think there's a problem. I think the problem is how she got there. I think the problem is how she was promoted and how people said, oh, this is one who can work for us, and she's ready to deal in all the rest. And I think you'll find that in her history, she did some good things at some time, and then she figured this isn't getting me where I want to go, so she changed. And she gave up her left leanings and became, you know, a brute. The people who are ready to watch children go without food, you know, they should be put in concentration camps. They should be able to concentrate on that subject. You know, Marcus Rashford was really the prime minister for a little period, you know, because everything he did, what's his name, had to follow the greatest liar the world has ever seen, our former prime minister.
John.
Not mine.